Here's your wrestling news for June 15th, 2021. And your headlines for today include: Triple H snatched Samoa Joe back as soon as possible for WWE NXT. Will most likely replace William Regal. What is the current status of Samoa Joe's in-ring return? Did WWE spoil the WWE Championship match at Hell in a Cell on Raw? Why WWE punished their own wrestler? WWE is finally penning a good storyline with Randy Orton, Riddle, and MVP. Vince McMahon makes new rule against producing cold matches in WWE. Piper Niven makes her WWE Raw debut, hardly gets a mention. Wrestling fans are calling out AEW for doing something totally unexpected, and more. We're starting today with NXT, and at In Your House, William Regal ended the show on a somber note, promising a monumental announcement that'll affect the entire Gold brand. In that interview, Regal explained that in his 7 years as NXT's general manager, he's never seen the show so chaotic, and we may now know what the Legends announcement will be. On Wrestling Observer Radio, Dave Meltzer discussed how Regal said it's time for a change, and this will mark the return of Samoa Joe. He explained, "I was told today that Samoa Joe was going to be in a Regal-like role. Then all of a sudden Regal's talking like he's stepping down, so maybe the Regal-like role is Regal's role. But if he's leaving, based on what I was told, Samoa Joe was definitely the favorite to be the new commissioner." The fact that Joe will be in an authority role implies that he's still not cleared to wrestle after suffering a concussion in early 2020 whilst filming a commercial for Raw. Meltzer added that Joe has taken a job in NXT, and whether he'll be on screen or not, he'll definitely be behind the scenes. Meltzer's report was later confirmed by PW Insider, who reported that it didn't take WWE long to re-sign the former US champion. In the report, it was noted that Triple H, quote, snatched him back as soon as he possibly could, with one source saying the game wanted him back in NXT specifically rather than anywhere else. Triple H was the man who brought Samoa Joe to WWE in 2015 and made him a two-time NXT champion before his main roster call-up in 2017. Joe was recently spotted at the Performance Center, though it's reported that he wasn't backstage during In Your House. The former superstar/commentator was only released by WWE in April, but now he's back with the company, and fans could be seeing him as soon as tonight's NXT. Whilst Joe will be returning very soon, fans shouldn't expect him to wrestle, as he's still not cleared to wrestle after his concussion last year. On Wrestling Observer Radio, Meltzer made it clear that Joe is very likely not cleared to compete, but that no other company could use him as a wrestler either, which may explain his return to NXT. He added, "Joe is in, and he's in as a non-wrestler. So I think that tells you that he's not cleared, so even if you wanted him to go to another company, if he's not medically cleared, that is probably, I don't want to say impossible, because we've seen too many examples of people who are not medically cleared for life who end up wrestling again, so it's just what it is. You know, he's taking a job in NXT, and he's doing something there. He may be the new authority figure on television. He may not be, but he's doing something behind the scenes." Samoa Joe has a ton of experience that could benefit NXT superstars, and WWE would be wise to do the most they can with him, even if that still means they can't book him for a match. At Hell in a Cell, WWE champion Bobby Lashley and Drew McIntyre will collide in the titular structure, a match worthy of headlining the event. With Universal Champion Roman Reigns reportedly demanding he either open or close pay-per-views, there's a chance that his match with Rey Mysterio could kick things off on Sunday, with Lashley and McIntyre closing the show. On last night's Raw, the pair looked to wrap up their feud for good, as the main event was originally meant to be McIntyre versus AJ Styles before Lashley, the Viking Raiders, and Omos got involved. As we previously predicted, the match became a six-man tag, though the only notable moment was the result, which saw McIntyre pin the WWE champion. Given that Drew pinned Lashley last night, it's expected that Lashley will retain this Sunday, as WWE loves 50-50 booking. And if that happens, the stipulation of the Hell in a Cell match will mean Drew can't challenge for the WWE title as long as Lashley is champion. Lashley was expected to retain the title before Raw, but his loss during the Red Brand has practically spoiled the result of this Sunday's match, as WWE has revealed they have no plans of him dropping the title anytime soon. As for McIntyre, his impending loss on Sunday will mean he'll take a step back from the title picture, and with Drew being a fixture of the main event for the past year, with a growing number of fans getting annoyed at this, losing this Sunday is probably for the best. Last year, Retribution made their debut in WWE during a time of a lot of social unrest in America. Bent on destroying WWE from the inside, the group mirrored a lot of the real-life unrest in the US, and Vanessa Bourne was rumored to have been one of the members early on before being pulled from the group. Speaking to PW Insider this week, Bourne discussed her brief tenure under one of Retribution's hoods, saying, "I had some concerns because during this time there was stuff around the country with violence and we're watching this unfold and it's not pretty. I wanted to know if the group was mimicking that. I expressed those concerns. Within a week, I got a call from Mark Carrano saying, 'We're not going to have you as part of Retribution and we're going to pull your contract. You're getting sent back to NXT.' I felt like I got kicked in the gut." Bourne added that she still kicks herself over not just accepting the chance to be on the main roster, but given how Retribution ultimately panned out, it's possibly for the best that she wasn't involved. Splitting up on the Fastlane kickoff show, Mace and T-Bar remain a tag team on Raw, though there's been no sign of Reckoning, aka Mia Yim, and who knows what Vanessa Bourne would be doing now had she not voiced her view on the controversial group. More from Raw now, as RK Bro has been on fire since teaming up, thanks in part to the unexpected chemistry of Riddle and Randy Orton. Despite Riddle losing to Kofi Kingston on last week's Raw, Orton has been protected, with Riddle having an interesting interaction with Jeff Hardy this week, who told him to listen to the veteran Apex Predator. Together, RK Bro would have a barn burner of a match against The New Day, which feels more like a Raw Tag Team title feud than anything AJ Styles and Omos have done. RK Bro's rise to the top of the tag team division has been enjoyable as it's been unexpected, and after the match, which saw Xavier Woods get pinned, Kofi Kingston had yet another segment with MVP. Backstage, MVP berated The New Day, saying Kingston is wasting his career in tag team action, pointing out that Kofi lost this week despite not being pinned. Despite insulting Xavier Woods, the up-up-down-down star looked a little too tense as he looked on, and though we're not sure what the endgame here is, don't be surprised if Woods is the one to turn on Kingston instead. Last night's show also saw Jeff Hardy face Cedric Alexander with some major stakes on the line. After losing to John Morrison earlier in the show, Jeff said that if he couldn't beat the former Hurt Business member, he'd retire for good, though Hardy would keep his career going, beating Alexander in a 3-minute match. This stipulation got fans wondering why Jeff would put his career on the line in a random match, and it turns out it's part of a new rule by Vince McMahon. Ringside News is reporting that McMahon has been beating up the writers and producers over suggestions for cold matches, which are random matches that aren't part of a storyline. Now, there's an unwritten rule that no more cold matches will be produced, as the company is looking for stories and drama rather than just having a match to fill the show. As we previously reported, McMahon is looking for characters to call up from NXT in the coming months, not wrestlers, and like all edicts from the chairman, we'll have to see how long this new rule lasts. This week's show also saw Eva Marie make her in-person return to the Red brand after 4 years away, but she didn't come alone. Despite the match announced being Eva versus Naomi, much to the annoyance of fans of Naomi, Eva Marie brought out NXT UK's Piper Niven, who destroyed the former SmackDown Women's Champion in quick fashion. The announcers didn't even give Niven a name on Raw, meaning she could be getting a name change soon, and following Piper's win, Eva Marie announced herself as the winner of the match. Sean Ross Sapp of Fightful reports that the pitch name for Niven is Dewdrop, though of course plans are always subject to change. Niven's Raw character is far different to her time in NXT UK, and it'll be interesting to see what kind of chemistry she has with Eva Marie. Niven's debut follows on from reports that the former Total Divas star would be returning with some muscle, and despite reports that she'd be pushed as a babyface, Eva Marie is back to her heel ways, taking credit for the work of others. If you've heard of Brazzers, you'll know they're a company that caters to a mature audience, and it seems that whoever operates AEW's Twitter account is a part of that audience. On the official AEW Twitter, the company follows 893 accounts, and now Brazzers is one of them. Fans were quick to call out AEW, sharing screenshots of AEW following Brazzers, and Brazzers themselves have made no secret that they pay attention to pro wrestling, making an offer to Sasha Banks in October 2019. AEW is no stranger to following interesting accounts, as they also follow the Cain Velasquez, Reddit Squared Circle thread, and WWE Women's Tag Team Champion Natalya. But we doubt that you'll find a stranger account that AEW follows than the adult entertainment company. And we're ending with WWE, as last year WWE put out a rule outlawing their superstars having third-party deals on platforms such as Cameo and Twitch, but there have been some exceptions to this rule. Ahead of The Undertaker's final farewell, The Phenom did 30 cameo videos costing $1,000 each, and even more superstars were allowed to do cameos for WrestleMania, and now they're back. Ahead of Hell in a Cell, WWE have announced that several superstars will be doing cameo videos with some huge prices. It's interesting that Alexa Bliss and Seth Rollins cost $600 a video, more than WWE Champion Bobby Lashley, whilst Bliss, alongside Charlotte Flair, who costs $500, are more expensive than Raw Women's Champion Rhea Ripley and SmackDown Women's Champion Bianca Belair. We doubt that much if any of the money made by these videos will go to the wrestlers themselves, but if you're willing to spend several hundreds of dollars, you can get a personalized video from a WWE superstar. Well guys, that's our news for today. Please share your comments below. Also hit the like button, subscribe to our channel, and hit the bell icon to receive all notifications. And as always, thanks for watching.